Firstly, I want to thank you for coming, because it is a great honor for us to have you here. And we know we are going to learn a lot from you. She comes from the University of Lodz, from the Department of Pragmatics in the Faculty of Philology, and she is a member of the Institute of English Studies. Her research interests are the second language acquisition, the methodology of teaching foreign languages, psycholinguistics, pre- and in-service teacher training, learning difficulties, specifically developmental dyslexia, pragmatic language disorder, pragmatics and language learning, and the academic discourse. She obtained a lot of grants and coordinate a lot of projects, but I'm going to focus in one of them, of the other projects, or two, for better to say. This TELF, Dyslexia for Teachers of English as a Foreign Language, that she was the grant coordinator from 2011 to 2013, and 1 year later she was the grant coordinator of the second part of this project from 2014 and 2016. And we have here too one of the results of this second project, that is this book of dyslexia for teachers of English as a foreign language. And you can find here a lot of tips and activities to teach the teacher how to work with a dyslexic student. So I would like to express my admiration for her, my deep admiration for her, and I hope you all enjoy the presentation as much as I will. So when you want.
Thank you. Oh my goodness, thank you very much for the so kind introduction. I'm very honored to be here, and I'm delighted to be here. So thank you once again for inviting me. Okay, as you've heard, I'm so sorry for the way I look, but I'm carrying a very important object here. Okay, as you know, as you heard in the introduction, my background is in education and in linguistics. So I'm mainly preoccupied with second language acquisition and language didactics, with training teachers of English as a foreign language. That is the major thing I do. And the truth is that we had two very good projects, and I'm going to come back to the TEFL projects in my presentation. Okay, so let's move on then. I'll be trying not to move too much, and we'll give you the outline of the presentation in a second. But just before I move to the presentation itself, I would like to pay attention to a couple of issues, just to be aware that actually when you read through massive research on developmental dyslexia, you will see that this has focused on monolingual learners. Obviously in different languages, but monolingual learners, monolingual speakers. And that we already know from research that dyslexia can very much influence the acquisition of additional languages and in different contexts. And I just mentioned two contexts here, which are immersion and instructional setting. And when I talk about immersion, obviously you can have an immersion in instructional settings to a certain extent, right? We do have like bilingual schools, for example, or the situation where students are in the target language speaking country. They are surrounded by the language, they are immersed in a language, and the particular language that they are learning as their second language is the societal language, and this is also the language of instruction at school, meaning that every single subject is taught in this second language, right? When I talk about instructional setting, I would rather mean a situation like in Poland, for example, when most of our students in our foreign language classrooms are monolingual, okay, and we teach them English as a foreign language, and this is L2. So I presume that to a certain extent you have similar situation here in this country, right? So the instructional setting is the one that I'm going to concentrate most of the time in my talk, okay? Just to make it clear. All right, and most research, now when you move to a different field, when you move from the field of developmental dyslexia to second language research, you would see that studies conducted on how people learn to read in second language has focused on individuals who do not have any specific learning difficulty, okay? So with no dyslexia. So what we tried to do, we wanted to merge these two fields, and we wanted to research learning to read and spell in second language, but in learners who have the specific learning difficulty, dyslexia. Okay, and it has started not too many years ago, but so far there is quite a huge bulk of research that we accumulated, and I'm going just to give you some hints on what's going on in the area of second language acquisition studies in students, involving students with dyslexia. So there is a number of studies on cognitive and affective impact of dyslexia on second language processes. When you think of affective factors, there are very interesting studies on emotions, on anxiety, on motivation in these students, and also the second area involved teaching practices with dyslexic students and the effectiveness of particular instructional programs designed especially for those dyslexic learners. And we at Łódź University also conducted such studies. That was in 2008, and I'm going to show you some samples later on from these intervention studies. And then another area is a huge area of study which involves identification of dyslexia in multilingual speakers and assessment of the L2 skills in dyslexic learners. And there's a lot of a lot of research concerning diagnosis of dyslexia in situations where students learn a second language as a societal language and as a language of instruction, but at the same time they were not diagnosed as dyslexic in their L1. So this is a hard time really for teachers and diagnosticians to decide whether the difficulties in learning to read and write that they experience actually are because they are still learning the second language and their proficiency is not that high, or maybe due to other reasons. So I'll come back very shortly to this later on. And finally, the area of L2 teacher training that I'm going to concentrate on today. So you will hear more about what we have done so far and how we identified what is important to teach the teachers of foreign languages so that they can deal with students who have been diagnosed as dyslexic in the L1 and they attend foreign language classes. All right, so the plan of the talk is I'll shortly go through definition of dyslexia, not really definition, but the short characteristics so that we all know exactly what we are talking about here. And then I'll move to dyslexia in bilingual and especially in instructional settings. As I said, there's huge bulk of research on reading across different languages. And since there are considerable differences in the speed of acquisition of the reading skill across languages, and these are attributed to differences in the complexity of the orthographic systems. So again, there's a huge area of research, and I'm not going to refer to this in any detail. It's just of the scope of this presentation, but this is very interesting as well. So, and it can be consequential when parents or children or adult people who are dyslexic decide about which second language to learn. because simply some languages may be easier for them to learn than others, and that would depend on the complexity of the orthographic system. Okay, what I'm going to concentrate mostly on will be the construct, the concept of foreign language teachers' preparedness to teach dyslexic learners, which we call TEPIT. And I'll try to show you which factors we identified as the underlying components of the teacher preparedness. And as you can see, I just mentioned them here. It's background knowledge, self-efficacy beliefs, and attitudes. And I'm going to characterize each of these underlying factors first so that you understand well what preparedness is and why it's so important for us as teacher trainers. Because if we know exactly what the preparedness is composed of, we can design effective teacher training programs. So that was the first step for us in the research agenda. And then I'm going to refer to some studies that we did with a particular training program to see whether it's effective. And the program was written so that we could boost knowledge, self-efficacy beliefs, and attitude, and actually we checked it in research whether it was effective or not. So this is the heart of the talk. Yes, I mentioned that. Okay, so just going briefly through the first slides that I have here, just to characterize dyslexia. Those of you who deal with developmental dyslexia, you know that the body of research is massive. It's one of the most intensively investigated and probably one of the best known developmental cognitive language disorders. A lot has been published on it, and it has neurobiological and genetic roots. And since it's a neurobiological disorder and it also involves deficits in cognitive processes, there are different levels of explanation. And when you read through papers published in different journals, they very often refer to only some of the levels of explanation. But this is actually very in line what you've heard today in the previous lecture, that in order to explain language disorders, you need to go through all three levels. So dyslexia has got the biological prints and some traces, some genetic traces. So when you look at the biological level of explanation, this would refer to those genetic traces and the underlying brain mechanisms. And those mechanisms mentioned in different studies are, for example, disorganization of the cerebral cortex in the language areas, and a number of studies involving, as far as genetic roots are concerned, the family studies and twin studies, and then for structural and functional differences in the dyslexic and non-dyslexic brains, postmortem analysis, and functional neuroimaging. So you will find a lot of these studies. Then the cognitive level of explanation would relate to mind and mental processes, such as reduced phonological processing, poor phonological processing, poor working memory, incomplete automatization, or slow central processing. And finally, the behavioral level of explanation specifies the way dyslexia manifests itself in behavior. So you would then read about difficulty with rhymes, for example, as one of the indicators of poor phonological processing, and poor reading and spelling. So when trying to explain what dyslexia is, you need to see this causal chain going from biology to cognition to behavior and back, and also imagining that at each of these levels there are those environmental factors that would influence the picture. So this is extremely complex. And as we went through those three levels, biological, cognitive, and behavioral, you can imagine that there are a number of causal or explanatory theories of dyslexia that would be instantiated on different levels. So, for example, there is the cerebellar deficit hypothesis or magnocellular deficit hypothesis that are biological level hypothesis, right? And this is the explanation. And the most powerful cognitive explanation for dyslexia is the phonological deficit hypothesis that I'm going to talk about in greater detail in a second. Now, depending on the profession, your profession, or the profession of the researcher, actually, at the background of the researcher, and also depending on the level of disability adopted, so whether it's a medical model of disability or whether it's an interactional model of disability, different terms and different labels are used across literature to denote developmental dyslexia. For example, learning disability or learning disorder or specific learning difficulty. Since my background is in education, I'm more into interactional model of a disability, so I would not perceive it as a disease, but rather as a difficulty in learning. That's why I'll be using the specific learning difficulty term. And since it's learning difficulty, it implies, it indicates that the skills we are talking about must be learned. And specific would imply that the difficulties are restricted to a very limited number of skills. And in the case of dyslexia, obviously the skills are reading and spelling. The most prevailing difficulty, the most prevailing problem in dyslexia is difficulty in accurate and fluent single word decoding and encoding, which is spelling. And we can refer to this inaccurate and non-fluent single word decoding and problems with spelling in more general term, which is poor print processing. But as you can see, this refers merely to the mechanical aspect of reading, not to comprehension. So the difficulty in dyslexia is more with this mechanical aspect of reading, not with comprehension. However, comprehension problems may be a consequence of not being able to decode the text. All right. When you go through contemporary definitions, and I based those few remarks here on the two contemporary definitions, one of them adopted by the board of directors of the International Dyslexia Association, and the other one from the Rose report in 2009. So those dyslexic reading difficulties that we can observe in learning the skill are often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and in the presence of appropriate classroom instruction. So to a certain extent, for some people, it's just unbelievable how come they cannot learn if they are taught in the right way and they are intelligent people, and at the same time they are capable of performing well with respect to other skills. And also, it's important that the early signs of at risk for dyslexia can be observed in preschool, so very early. But the diagnosis at that time might not be very reliable. And this is, again, something that you've also heard during the previous lecture. And so normally, in most countries, at least the ones that I know and the ones that we conducted research in, the diagnosis is conducted after the onset of formal education. So it's usually after more or less 2 years of learning to read and spell. And this is when they can be diagnosed as having dyslexia. And obviously, it's not limited to any particular language. It's cross-linguistic, cross-cultural. It is chronic, and it's a lifetime condition. So it cannot be outgrown, unfortunately. So it typically persists into adulthood. However, it can be, I mean, the symptoms, the signs, the difficulties can be very much reduced if the appropriate teaching is applied. And I think that I already mentioned the way dyslexia would manifest itself depends very much on the orthographic system in a language that a given person is learning. And basically, when you think about orthographic systems in alphabetic languages, obviously, you would place them on a continuum from a very transparent orthographies with more or less one-to-one correspondence between a sound and a grapheme towards more complex and opaque orthographies where this relation is extremely complicated, like in English, for example, when you can use the same letter or cluster of letters to note down different sounds, when a particular sound can be noted down with a letter, 2 letters, or a cluster of 3 or 4 letters even, right? And so on and so forth. So the more transparent the orthography, at least theoretically, the easier it is to learn for dyslexic students. But then there is a danger that dyslexic students might be advised against learning English, for example, because it has an extremely opaque orthography. And here are, I think, at play other factors like motivation to learn English that is perceived as lingua franca. So when you think about providing equal chances for education for every single student, it's not enough to say, you know, this is too difficult to learn for you. It's not. You can learn it, and we know how to do it. And I'm going to show you how to do it, even though this requires probably more work and effort than learning other languages. And an important thing is, again, that when you think about dyslexia, it's not an either-or phenomenon, but again, it can be placed on a continuum. So when you think about the difficulties dyslexic students encounter in learning to read and write, they can be from very subtle through mild to severe. And then when we want to apply appropriate intervention, educational intervention, it has to be matched to the intensity of difficulties. So those students who experience only subtle difficulties would be normally treated, you know, in mainstream classes. They would not require any one-to-one tuition or special treatment. But the more severe difficulties, the more individualized and intensive treatment is required. And as I have mentioned so far, the environmental factors are extremely important in modifying, in shaping, in creating the way dyslexia manifests itself. And those factors include education and reading experience, whether children are read to at home, whether they have books at home, whether they read at home and at school, and also effectiveness of special interventions and classroom teaching methods, as well as individual learner differences as they would operate in any sort of language, such as age, sex, or motivation. It's important that all of these factors can either aggravate or ameliorate the clinical picture of dyslexia, but they would not cause dyslexia as such, right? And I've said already this. Now I would be moving to, as I said, it's out of the scope to discuss all theories explaining dyslexia that are at large, because that would take us hours, but I decided to concentrate on the core phonological deficit, which is the most which is probably the best supported hypothesis. So evidence for the phonological deficit in dyslexia comes from 3 main behavioral symptoms. The first one is poor phonological awareness, and this can be measured by phoneme segmentation and manipulation tasks, like adding phonemes, skipping phonemes, and changing the positions. And the second bulk of studies involve poor verbal short-term memory, and this one is measured with digit span and non-word repetition tasks. And finally, slow lexical retrieval, and that one is measured with rapid serial naming tasks. And what happens on the cognitive level, and why dyslexic students experience difficulties with phonological processing? So the phonological core deficit actually assumes that those phonological mental representations of sounds, which are to support fluent and accurate spoken word recognition and production, are deprived of distinctness and segmental specificity. So they are as if blurred, okay? They are not clearly cut. And that is why dyslexic students find it very hard to properly, to accurately identify and distinguish between, and then manipulate phonological units. And I'm using here the term phonological units because phonological units can be of different sizes, okay? So they are not necessarily individual sounds, but I'll come back to it later on. Now, you can imagine that if those mental representations of phonological units are blurred and not clear, this is extremely hard to form precise links between phonemes and graphemes. And then, at this point, I'd like to move to two hypotheses that actually justify all the other studies that we conducted in the area of second language acquisition and dyslexia. The first one is linguistic coding differences hypothesis proposed by American researchers Sparks and Genschel. And actually Sparks with his colleagues, because there were a number of people involved, conducted a massive number of studies involving both cognitive and affective aspects, as well as effective teaching interventions in students who are failing to learn second languages. Okay. So, linguistic coding differences hypothesis proposes that native language and foreign language are interdependent, and the success in the second language study would largely rely on L1 skills, which are usually developed prior to exposure to second language. It also assumes that native language skills form the foundation for second language learning, and that problems with one of the L1 components, for instance phonological processing, will affect both L1 and L2 learning and literacy development. So you can imagine that there exists a relation between very early levels of L1 skills, and especially L1 literacy, and L2 aptitude and proficiency, which is an extremely important piece of information for anyone researching language disorders in second language. And there's another framework that I would like to mention here. This is Common Underlying Cognitive Processes framework by Geban. That one indicates that individual differences in the underlying cognitive processes, such as working memory or phonological processing or awareness and rapid automatized naming, they can explain correlations between L1 and L2 relating to similar language and literacy, and predict word reading skills, spelling, and reading across languages again. So this is extremely important for I think I have it here. No. Okay, this is extremely important for the immersion situation that I talked about, okay, and for diagnosing dyslexia in second language for children who have not been diagnosed in the L1. And sometimes when they live in the target language speaking country, there is no chance, okay, that they will be diagnosed in the L1 because it's just not feasible. So the assessment of these underlying cognitive factors does not really require high levels of oral language proficiency, which is usually given as an argument that a child cannot be diagnosed, let's say, learning English as a second language, right, and speaking other language at home, that cannot be diagnosed in English because he or she has not reached yet, you know, oral language proficiency on a high enough level. It proves highly useful and informative in the case of learners with limited L2 oral language proficiency. So this is an important bit of information in this immersion setting. So primary deficit in dyslexia, which is impaired phonological processing, seems to be transferred from L1 to L2 and may affect the acquisition of reading and spelling skills in L2. So if kids are diagnosed with dyslexia in the L1, potentially teachers need to remember that this might cause difficulty in foreign language study. And the phonological processing skills in one language, no matter whether in L1 in the native language or foreign language, can predict individual differences in word decoding within and across these languages, which is great news, which means that even if the oral proficiency in the second language is not well developed, still you can work with the child and you can assess the child, and you've got tools to do that. You don't have to wait any longer. Okay, so diagnosing dyslexia in children from ethnic and linguistic minorities whose L1, they use L1, different language at home, and different language at school, and the second language, the foreign language, the societal language, and it's also the language of instruction, as I said, poses considerable problems. But, and this is what I've already mentioned, that they usually are not diagnosed in the L1. They come to the foreign language speaking country, usually being, you know, small babies, or sometimes they are born there, and they speak different language at home, and they need to learn the second language and then use it for instruction. Okay. What's important here is that very often teachers are reluctant to recognize that the reading and spelling difficulties that these children experience in learning the second language are actually because of dyslexia. Okay, so they would attribute the difficulties to not yet well-developed oral proficiency in the second language. So very often in these contexts, dyslexia may go unnoticed and unidentified. Okay. Now let's move to learners who have diagnosis in the L1, and let's move a bit to the instructional setting. So we have learners that have been diagnosed, let's say in Polish, that they have dyslexia. They attempt to learn second language, foreign language, which is English, for instance, and those students may be expected to experience difficulties. Why? Because the command of L2 is built upon their strengths in L1, okay? And we know that they have poor skills in L1, mostly within the area of phonological processing. The L2 literacy attainments of dyslexic learners may be expected thus to be inhibited. While when you think about the learners who possess strong L1 skills, potentially they should be better equipped to achieve high in L2 learning. And I've heard voices that, that dyslexic students should be dispelled from learning foreign languages, or that we should not force them to do it. I cannot accept this position. It's, it's just a matter of the right teaching. It's not that they are unable to do so, that they are unable to learn. There's no such a thing, there's no such a construct as inability to learn foreign languages, okay? It might cause problems, but it's not impossible. All right. I would like to cite some evidence here that the two hypotheses that I have just brought to floor here, including the linguistic coding differences hypothesis, they are reflected in research findings as well, and they are supported by the accumulating evidence, which actually confirms that dyslexic learners experience difficulties of varying severity in learning second language and second language literacy, both in instructed classrooms and in immersion settings. So there's a lot of accumulated evidence so far that these two hypotheses actually get supported. However, there exists considerable variation, and this is very interesting, in L2 learning and attainment among those dyslexic students, which means that some of them actually are very good learners of foreign languages. And obviously, this is very hard to explain, and it has to be done on, with individual cases. But the explanations proposed by the researchers are that there must be those external environmental factors operating here, that they are motivated enough, for example, to battle the difficulties they experience because they really long to learn a foreign language. So we need to be very cautious with forcing the attitudes that all dyslexic students will find it difficult to learn foreign languages, because it's I'm always hedging this sort of sentence, saying that they might, and we can expect them based on the evidence from research, but there are cases that apparently would not support this claim. So they can outperform non-dyslexic peers in certain tasks in learning L2 or L1, but in most cases they would be slightly lagging behind their peers in learning the foreign language as well. And it's important to remember, as I mentioned, that those dyslexic learners' L2 learning and performance in the classroom and outside classroom can be further diversified, and I mean either boosted or inhabited by the affective and cognitive factors, as well as dynamically interacting environmental influences. Okay, just to show you a couple of samples. These are 2 consecutive pages from the English as a Foreign Language notebook of a 14-year-old boy, and just want to show you some specific mistakes associated with dyslexia. Very inconsistent spelling. Can you see? Right, the word dull spelled in different ways on the same page, the same as with and with things, mistaken for things. And also phonetic writing, like 5 and ice skating ring. This is probably an extremely difficult for you to decode. Do you have any idea what word is that? Well, those of you who happen to know Polish would look at this word because this is in Polish. So this could help. Well, this is vehicle. Vehicle. So as you can see, the phonological analysis was distorted, okay? And that's why incorrect graphemes were used here, and this is just a non-word. And the difficulty is that a teacher cannot decode it, right? Because this is so phonologically distorted. Okay, when you look at this again, very inconsistent spelling. They seem to resemble English words more. That one is like phonetic writing using, it's more similar to Polish, okay? But that was supposed to be thread, okay? Okay, and when you look at this one, again, a typical mistake when the boundaries between words are hard to decipher. Okay, so they would have difficulty seeing where one word ends and another one begins. And also, can you say what this one is? Can you read it? Yes, this should be habitat, but as you can see, again, a little diacritical marks are missing, and again, this is something characteristic that you can find in dyslexic writing, and a few more examples here. Okay, and I would like to show you this one. This is really frustrating when you look at it, and I think you already feel what happened there, right? So this is, again, this is one page. I just took a photo of 2 sides from a 10-year-old boy notebook in English. What do you think? What they were doing during the lesson? What he was trying to do here? And he got carried away, like he got furious, you know, started shouting and crying. And that was really frustrating for the teacher and for all of us present in the room. But what was going on here? Can you decipher? Can you see the lines here? Like this? What do you think they were doing in the lesson? Have you ever done crosswords in your foreign language classes? Okay, and with dyslexic students, when they have enormous difficulty in rewriting from the board, just try to imagine, okay? So they are sitting at their desk looking into their notebook. They need to look up, find the place on the board, remember the sequence, look down again, find the place where they finished, okay? And by the moment they find the place, they already forgot what they tried to remember looking at the board. So he was exhausted. He was exhausted, he's had enough, and when you look at it, he really tried to work hard, okay? But it's just impossible to decipher, you know, the words, and you would not see the structure, because the structure, like the sequence of those little, you know, squares, was also impossible for him to rewrite. This could be very easy to avoid, just giving him handout, right? and not asking him to fill in the crossword and rewrite from the board. So a sad example, but very much telling. Okay, so let's move now to professional training. we conducted a number of studies. As I said, I will not be referring to intervention studies with students, but I will rather concentrate on identifying teachers' professional training needs and then looking for factors that build the preparedness for teaching dyslexics. So what we did first, we conducted 3 studies. We were trying to verify what are the professional training needs. So that was basically a so-called need analysis. We use desk study research, and we use survey research and questionnaires and interviews. And in the desk research, you can see that a number of countries, these were my colleagues from these countries, they participated in the study. So what we did in a desk research, we analyzed carefully all the possible teacher training programs in these countries. And we analyzed the programs, what they do, the content, everything. And the outcome was terrifying. Basically, teachers were not trained. Okay? If they got any information on dyslexia, on other specific difficulties in learning, on special educational needs, on inclusive education, these were like, you know, bits and pieces that were just the part of other courses, and only when, you know, the academic teachers were aware of these things, they managed to learn about that. And then in a survey, well, altogether we had, like, in those 3 studies, we had over 1,700 respondents. And the studies I'm going to refer now, most of them will be large-scale studies. So this gives us more possibilities to draw binding conclusions. So I will not get into details in each of these studies. I will just summarize what we found out in those 3 studies. So first of all, and this is what teachers report, these are their words, okay? They lack understanding of the nature of dyslexia and the difficulties it causes in foreign language learning. So if you think about the teacher of this poor 10-year-old boy, it was not because he was a bad teacher, he was not well trained. He just didn't know what to do, okay? And they also report that they lack knowledge of inclusive teaching principles and practices, which means what is it that I can do as a teacher when I have a class full of students and among them I have dyslexic learners. And I do have, because 10% of the population is dyslexic. So even by chance I have at least 1 or 2 in my class, right? So those inclusive teaching practices would involve all sorts of little adjustments and accommodations that you can make in the classroom, in addition to reading intervention that those students get in the L1. At least in my country, it's not yet the common practice that they would get it in L2, right? And they also indicated poor participation or even exclusion of special education needs students from foreign language education. So basically the situation was very sad, because when they were commenting on their behavior, their teaching practices towards dyslexic students, they tend to say that actually they would not involve dyslexic students not to make them anxious, you know? So they just did not want to do any more harm to them. But at the same time, they would not involve them and use their potential, and basically they would not teach them. And again, all these teachers tended to trace down the fact that they were not prepared to inadequate or insufficient pre- and in-service training. So the studies, both the desk research studies and the surveys, the 3 survey studies here were consistent in that there is not enough and adequate training offered to teachers of foreign languages. Happily for us, all of them, really, all of them said they were willing to participate in various types of training. Not everyone could afford face-to-face training or joining the university for longer courses, but teachers were ready to take, you know, online courses, even self-study online courses, anything to give them so that they can read through and learn and learn more. Okay, so then once we confirmed what we expected, that there is a huge need for adequate professional training, we wanted to check what is it what is it that we need to plan, how we have to design our courses so that we answer the need of the teachers. So we wanted to clarify what are the underlying, I should use this rather than my finger, what are the underlying components of preparedness to successfully include dyslexic learners in mainstream classrooms. And what we did, we developed and we validated the TEPIT scale. And what we did first is we wanted to identify those teachers' beliefs about how well they are prepared to include learners with dyslexia in their mainstream classrooms. And in this study, we had participants from 3 countries, Cyprus, Greece, and Poland, about 550 respondents. Actually, we had like over 800, but we decided to use only complete questionnaires for this, just to make sure that we do not commit any mistakes in drawing conclusions. And we did 2 things. We used statistical measures to test measurement invariance. What does that mean? It means that we actually confirmed that the measurement was invariant across the 3 groups. This means that teachers in all 3 countries, and mind you, these are different systems, right? Different educational system, different teacher training system, maybe different attitudes, maybe different mentality, so those teachers differed in a cultural sense. And we wanted to be sure that what we measure is exactly the same thing across board, right? So we confirmed that. And then we also used statistical tests to find the factors underlying the preparedness, and then to show that this factorial structure, again, is invariant across the board. In other words, that teachers from 3 countries here, okay, when we analyzed their responses, actually we found out, first of all, that what we measure is exactly the same across the board, which means that those teachers attributed the same meaning to the concepts that we asked about, and then that the factorial structure, so the factors that we identified in every single group, were exactly the same. This means that we can then compare valid cross-country comparisons, and that any interested researchers actually can use the TEPIT scale to find the same about teachers in other countries. So this is what we really wanted to achieve, to get the instrument that would allow us to get additional samples from other countries and to see whether this is the prevailing phenomena, you know, across countries and languages. Okay, so we did those cross-country comparisons of teachers from Cyprus, Greece, and Poland on their preparedness for inclusion. Now, let's look at the factors that made up the TEPIT's teacher preparedness. So basically there are 2 factors. The first factor is knowledge of dyslexia and self-efficacy in implementing inclusive instructional practices. Self-efficacy is, in other words, the skills, but I'll explain it in a second. And the second factor is the attitude and the stance towards inclusion. So what we thought is that when we'll be designing a teacher training program, we need to make it so that after completing the course, we boost knowledge, self-efficacy beliefs, and positive attitudes, right? Logical? Okay. So let me now, what I want to do, just to give you, because it's easily said, but I want you to get deeper understanding of what I mean by knowledge, what is it exactly that they should know, and what is self-efficacy. Okay, and I will tell you less about attitude because this is more or less, I think, self-evident. Okay, so what sort of background knowledge teachers should have? So the first, as if bunch of things here is the knowledge of the nature of dyslexia and how it influences second language study, and what are the effective techniques and inclusive instructional practices that they can use in mainstream classrooms, and also what are the underlying theoretical principles of effective reading intervention programs. This is extremely important here because those underlying theoretical principles are the things that I've talked about at the beginning, right? The phonological deficit and so on, so that they understand why in the intervention meetings with language therapists, those students actually work on phonological awareness. So those teachers need to have this sort of knowledge, even though they would not conduct any particular one-to-one intervention. Do you understand? It's just important that they know it. Okay, and what else? They also, actually it turned out that also the knowledge of local educational policy is extremely important. Why? Because the local policies involving, you know, educational regulations would tell you exactly what sort of, for example, exam accommodations you can use with dyslexic students. Do you have any accommodations here in Spain for dyslexic students in external exams? Like, for example, extended time for writing, a scribe or a reader. Okay, so these are the things, more or less, right? Okay, second type of knowledge is the language-based content knowledge required to understand the nature of dyslexic language learning problems and principles of effective teaching approaches. And this would involve knowledge of language and literacy concepts, explicit reading instruction principles, phonological awareness, orthographic awareness, phonics, and so on. Okay, so two types of knowledge. Okay, before I move to, I got tired. Just, sorry. All right, before I move to explaining self-efficacy beliefs, I would show you some examples of how we worked on developing these two types of knowledge. So we taught the teachers, and this is the part of the DSTEFL program for training teachers. We taught them about research-validated educational activities recommended for dyslexic students. So about using explicit teaching procedures, about direct teaching of developing phonological awareness and so on, you know, because nowadays, I don't know whether, again, it's the case in this country, but in the countries that participated in the study, the prevailing methodology of teaching foreign languages is communicative methodology, which actually would get rid of any direct and explicit teaching of phonological or orthographic aspects. And also, this is the sort of methodology that does not really approve of drilling. And you know, with dyslexic students, you need a lot of drilling. It does not mean that you would ask them to, you know, repeat the same sentence 100 times. You just do it in disguise, giving them games, for example, right? But drilling is and overall learning are crucial. We taught them that direct multisensory instruction in the above-mentioned areas is crucial and that it leads to highly positive effects in terms of spelling and reading. We also taught them about the differences in languages and in orthographic systems, which actually require then different strategies to develop when learning to read and spell. So, for example, phonemes should be given special attention in teaching reading in more consistent languages, right? In deeper orthographies, small and large grain size units and whole word approach should be used. So, deeper orthography is English, right? So I'm going to show you some examples what I mean by those larger phonological units like onsets and rhymes. When you look at these four words, okay, cat, hat, rat, bat, can you see that they have different onsets and they have a common rhyme, okay? So all the words in a given group that have the same rhyme, and this is spelled R-I-M-E, not like rhyming words. This is a bit confusing, but all of these will be also rhyming words, like cat rhymes with hat and rhymes with rat, rhymes with bat, right? Okay, so k, h, r, b are onsets, okay, and the remaining part is a rhyme. So in English, an ability to recognize those onsets and rhymes helps to recognize and to categorize words into groups. And children learn to decode words through analogy and form word families. And we call this an orthographic neighborhood, because the spelling of these words will be very similar. They will just differ with the first letter. And also the sequence is extremely important, like perceiving words within the sentence first, then bigger chunks like syllables, onsets, and rhymes within words, and finally you move on to teaching individual phonemes. And this is consistent with the developmental sequence. When children learning the L1 develop phonologically, they first learn bigger chunks and then smaller. Okay, now I mentioned that the approaches to teaching that have been validated by research involve multisensory teaching. So this multisensory teaching will involve using, like, for example, visual clues or auditory clues like boxes, blocks, tokens, or cards, something the students could manipulate, something that would represent the phonological structure of words. Do you understand? Like for every bit, like you have cat, hat, rat, okay, so you have like separate, let's say, little cards or tokens with them. And also that these auditory and visual representations are actually later on substituted with letters. What we also use and what we teach students is that when they add color coding, flashcards, tracing drills, spelling stickers, graphic models of words, word slides, and flip cards, this makes drilling possible, okay, but not boring. Okay, and I'm going to show you some pictures of the teaching aids that we used. So dividing words into onsets and rhymes. Okay, so these are the pictures that we work with. This is actually, you know, a model, but I'm going to show you real pictures that we used, you know, during workshops with teachers, but also with students. So these are so-called slides. Okay, so again, you have onsets, different onsets, and a rhyme. Can you see? And then when you just move this little part, you can form a new word. And again, you drill. Okay, you read, you can spell. But it's drilling in disguise. Just children love it. They just like doing that. And you can do it in different ways. So you can have slides like this, but you can make it on a circle. And just by moving the circle, you form new words. And these are the original pictures, the real ones, and the cards that we used. So as you can see, this is reality. This is how we work. Okay, and these are the ones produced by children. They actually use that, and later on also teachers use this and work with this. And here when you're used to dividing words into particular sounds, so first you see that you work on so-called Elkonin boxes, so they are just empty boxes, and then you identify individual sounds and you count the sounds, and then for every single sound you put a little token here with no letters yet, and then the final stage will be putting letters on those little cards, right? So we work with this one. So this is badge. Some of you asked me about the badge. So Elkonin boxes. Then we identify the sounds, b, a, t, and we place the sounds from the left to the right, as later on we write the word. And finally, wow, we introduce the letters. And as you can see, we also cut the pictures. We also cut the pictures into pieces. Can you see? We cut them into as many pieces, as many sounds there are in the word. And again, they need to manipulate, put it together. And when you work on manipulating the sounds, like skipping the sounds or substituting the sounds, this is very easy because you've got those physical objects that you can take and manipulate. And this helps a lot. Okay. And these are real teaching aids that we used. As you can see, we use threading, and we have those little flip chart books. Then when you flip the cards, you form new words. Okay. All right. Now, this was some examples for phonological awareness training. Then when you move to orthographic awareness training and teaching spelling rules, you would combine those multisensory techniques and direct teaching, and especially with regard to sounds that have several possible spelling choices, which is the case in English, right? Like train, say, place. This is exactly the same sound, but to three different spelling choices, or might, try, time. And again, you need to provide ample practice and repetition opportunities to consolidate spelling. And to use it again, not to make it boring, you would use games. So we have like stickers. You see, we have different spelling choices for the ch sound here in English, and they simply need to finish. And we have bingo game and dominoes, right? And in bingo, you would not believe, but this is from our intervention study, and dyslexic students, we had this for, the program for them was like for 6 months, and I think somewhere during the 4th month already, they become so skillful in doing the bingo game that they put like 4 cards at the same time, you know, and listening to words, they were able to cover the words they listened on 4 cards. Teachers could not do that. Okay, so we really overtrained them in this respect. But games actually made a difference here. Okay, and those spelling choices for individual words, again, you see models for teaching aids that you can use, and the color coding. So what we did here, we color coded every single long vowel with a different color, and we designed a number of movable devices, and these are the original ones that we actually produced and used. So for the I vowel, you see we coded it in green, and for the E. And then you have, do you know this rule, by the way? Do you know, how many orthographic rules do you know? How many spelling rules do you know in English? Have you ever thought about this? Okay, they are more than you can expect, but simply because you learned the language easily, you were never forced to search for some other ways to remember this. So this is so-called magic E rules. So this is a magic E. As you can see, it operates for 4 long vowels in English. So if you imagine there is no E here, how would you read the word? Without E. It would be live, right? So this vowel would go short. So the magic E rule is that when in the single syllable word you have the E at the end, it makes the middle vowel long. That's why we read the word life, okay? When E disappears, it's live. So again, what we tried to figure out, and that was quite a difficult task, was to choose the most productive spelling rules. So the ones that would give the best tools for to students to spell correctly. And the final example that I have here is for developing morphological awareness. You know, when we talk to dyslexic students, they tended to report that, you know, when they see all these words in a given family, they would learn every single word as a separate entity. So what we tried to do is to show them a better way of doing this and teaching them some phonological rules, some morphological rules, so that they can easily, you know, have at their disposal the whole family rather than, you know, learning each of these words separately. And we designed movable devices that they could use. I don't know whether you can see clearly how it works, but the base word is in the middle, and then you manipulate the cards here to add prefixes and suffixes to form words. And again, this is extremely productive, and they, you know, first they manipulated the cards that we produced, then they were spelling down, noting down the words, and then they were producing their own word families and so on. Okay, moving on now to self-efficacy beliefs. So we talked about 2 types of knowledge, and now we are moving to self-efficacy beliefs. What are they? Self-efficacy belief is an enormously powerful concept. It is the assessment of that teachers make of their perceived competence and ability to perform in the classroom, so that the instructional behavior can trigger desired student behavior and learning. So this is how they assess themselves they can do in the classroom. And self-efficacy is context and task specific. So you can think of yourself as being self-efficacious in certain areas of teaching, but not being that particularly good in the others, okay? Or in doing certain tasks, not the others. And fortunately enough, it's also subject to changes triggered by teaching experience and training. So we can manipulate, we can modify, okay? We can shape self-efficacy beliefs. And those beliefs are powerful enough to influence both teachers' attitudes to inclusion and their actual teaching practices. which is unbelievable. Okay, when you think about it, how powerful it is. It's like holding them back from trying different things in the classroom. So that was extremely important, to find ways to boost self-efficacy beliefs in those teachers so that they are braver and eager, you know, to go and teach in the classroom. And self-efficacy beliefs can also affect learners' self-efficacy beliefs and determine both the way they achieve in the classroom and the level of their motivation, which is again a very powerful thing, right? So if they see that the teacher is self-efficacious, they would be more willing and more motivated to work. And basically, teachers who believe they are less efficacious may show less commitment to teaching and persistence when facing difficulties. Okay, so what is it that they need to, that they should be convinced of being able to do, right, in the classroom? Manage classroom environment, differentiate instruction, teaching context, tasks, assignments, modes of presentation, assessment, feedback techniques, and so on. Help learners develop successful learning strategies. And basically, when you think about classrooms, these are the areas that they need to differentiate and individualize their approach to students. So this is really terrifying, isn't it, for a teacher who is not well trained in it. I'm going to show you just a simple example of assessment adjustments and strategies that we used. So these are accommodations in exams and tests, and for example, accommodations in the presentation format. Okay, you can do oral reading, you can introduce large print, magnification devices, screen reader, colored overlays. You can see them here, can you see? These are colored overlays. You can introduce some changes into response format. For example, allow them to use computers or have a scribe, like a dyslexic person can dictate the work to somebody. Okay, and again, accommodations in timing and in setting and so on. So there are a number of things that teachers can do in the classroom, in addition to training that they get on individual basis. And attitudes involve recognizing the importance of individualized approaches, and also how positive the attitude is would depend on the social encounters with dyslexic students and whether teachers have direct contact and successful teaching experience. The more direct contact and the more successful teaching experience, the more positive the attitudes. Okay, and do I still have a couple of minutes? What do you think? A few, you'll be okay. All right, so we also looked at a number of demographic variables, and this is this is interesting because overall teaching experience, which is basically operationalized as yes in teaching, did not influence in any way the level of preparedness. Can you imagine? It doesn't matter how many years you teach, and also completed level of education, whether you had BA, MA, or PhD. The differences were obtained for the country. So apparently there must have been differences between Greek, Cypriot and Polish educational systems in preparing teachers to work. And level of training, quite clear thing that in-service teachers were believed they were better prepared than pre-service. And the thing that mattered was the type of experience of dyslexic learners. So those who had this direct individual experience actually believed were better prepared. Okay, and just, I don't have time to go into detail because the microphone is going to another person. But what I would like you, one more thing I would like to tell you is that we did professional training. So first of all, we designed the course, and this is the DISTEFL course. We had two editions of the course, and actually the materials were assessed very high. We were granted the Elton's Award for Excellence in Course Innovation for this. This was the result of the DISTEFL and DISTEFL 2 projects. And we wrote the materials and we designed training in different modes. So the MOOC training, which is Massive Open Online Learning course. And actually I know that some of you have completed this course. So we had 4 editions so far. And the first 3 editions had 18,000 participants each from all over the world. And they were really motivated to learn. And just to tell you, I just skip this. This is actually, when you look at the red bars, you see how they assess their knowledge after the course, okay, how it grew. And also, important thing is that the self-efficacy beliefs and attitudes grew considerably. So we managed in 2 editions of the course actually to achieve this. I'll skip the previous training, I will skip that, and just want to show you a second one. We replicated the study, and then we also did another course just to show you the difference. And this is a small scale study when we have just 67 participants and we have very intensive face-to-face training. So what I'm trying to say that we verified everything that I talked about, the whole methodology, using different types of training. And actually we proved that these trainings were effective and successful in boosting knowledge, self-efficacy beliefs, and attitudes of teachers. So those 3 crucial underlying factors of teacher preparedness. Okay, and I think I'll stop here as I don't have more time. I could continue more, but the conclusions are really, I think, positive. So first of all, we know already how to do it. We verified it. We got very positive feedback. We had like huge number of teachers completing the study and going into classrooms. The next steps and the next studies we are going to conduct would involve verifying the actual teaching practices, because everything that I've talked about so far involve the perceived teaching practices. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, we have a few minutes to ask some questions, so if you have one.
Or maybe I will be available for questions during coffee break, so that not to hold anybody. Okay, thank you once again, and I'll answer all the questions during coffee break, all right? Okay, thank you.
Okay.